Mom's Perfect Order. This is the story of how my mother lost everything to the man she trusted most, and how in the end, it gave us the family we'd been missing all along. I realized my mother had lost her house when I tried to pay her property taxes. The reminder popped up on my phone as usual. Pay Mom's house taxes. I'd been doing this for the past 5 years because online payments scared her. I logged onto the tax office website, entered the address. The system showed balance due $0, status paid in full. Strange. The deadline was still 2 months away, and I definitely hadn't paid yet. I tried logging into Mom's account. The system gave me an error. Access restricted. Contact property owner. Property owner? What property owner? I clicked on the public ownership information. The screen loaded, and my world collapsed. Property owner, Richard Clark. Date of ownership transfer, February 14th, 2024. Basis, gift deed. Richard, Mom's husband. The man she married at 72. To everyone's amazement. You see, Mom was an impossible person to live with. Her obsessive need for perfect order had led to divorce from Dad when my brother and I were teenagers, and she'd kicked us out of the house the moment we could fend for ourselves. She'd lived alone for 20 years in her pristine home, and we thought that's how it would stay. Then Richard Clark appeared, 12 years younger, charming with impeccable manners, and the most incredible thing, he worshipped Mom's quirks. Where we saw unbearable nitpicking, he saw high standards. When Mom demanded books arranged by height, he'd pull out a ruler. When she insisted on silence after 8 p.m., he'd buy special slippers. My brother and I would wonder, had Mom finally found her match? Staring at the computer screen, I realized we'd been blind idiots. My hands shook as I dialed Mom's number. The rings seemed endless. Finally, Mom picked up, her voice sounding normal, calm, but slightly annoyed. I asked her about documents she'd signed in February. First, there was silence. Then Mom said she didn't remember any special documents. When I explained the house situation, she didn't believe it. Then she remembered Valentine's Day, when Richard talked about a romantic gift and tax documents. Mom thought they were just papers for filing joint tax returns. I called Richard, but got voicemail. I texted asking to urgently discuss Mom and the house. No response all day. The next morning, Mom called me in tears. She'd tried to withdraw money from the ATM, but her card was blocked. When she called the bank, they told her their joint account had been closed the night before, right after my call to Richard. All $83,000 withdrawn. Richard wasn't home. His phone was disconnected. 2 days later, the mailman delivered a certified letter from a law firm. Richard was filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The documents included a demand to vacate the house within 30 days, since according to the February 14th gift deed, he was the sole owner. I rushed to Clearwater. The letter was typed, signed by hand. Cold, businesslike tone. No explanations, no apologies. Mom sat at the kitchen table in the same dress as yesterday. Hair disheveled, eyes red. An untouched cup of coffee sat on the table. She couldn't understand. Yesterday evening, everything had been normal. They'd watched the news. He'd helped her with the crossword. And this morning, she woke up alone with him already gone. I helped Mom pack her things and suggested she come stay with me. She kept saying this was her house where she'd lived for 40 years, but eventually agreed. While the case was ongoing, it would be safer at my place. Packed her essentials, moving like she was in a dream. mechanically folding clothes into a suitcase. Several times she stopped in the middle of the room, looked around, and cried quietly. She asked how she could have been such a fool. She was 74 years old, had lived a whole life, and let herself be deceived like a child. I explained to Mom that he was a professional who studied people and knew which buttons to push. The signs had been there, but Richard had appeared in Mom's life at exactly the right time, when she was especially in need of support. She was dealing with health issues, arthritis that limited her mobility, and felt vulnerable. Richard had been attentive, caring, perfectly matching her ideas of the right kind of man. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, went to bed early, kept the house in perfect cleanliness. But now I understood. He was just playing a role. The real Richard only showed himself now. Cold, calculating, ruthless. When we got to my house, Mom looked lost. My home was the complete opposite of her perfect world. Kids running through the hallways, the dog barking, TV playing in the background, unwashed breakfast dishes piled on the kitchen table. I apologized for the mess, clearing toys from the couch in the guest room. Mom quietly replied that it didn't matter anymore. The first week was hard for everyone. Mom would get up at 5 a.m. and start cleaning. By the time we woke up, the house gleamed like new. She'd wash already clean dishes, rearrange books by size, fold children's clothes by color. The kids were scared of her at first. They remembered Grandma as the strict woman who frowned at their noise and constantly made corrections. But now Mom was different. Quiet, sad, lost. But gradually, something changed. Emma, my 12-year-old daughter, was the first to approach Grandma. She asked if she was sad when Mom was once again wiping an already clean table. Mom stopped, looked at her granddaughter, and cried, admitting she was very sad. Emma asked if she could hug her. This was the turning point. Emma hugged Grandma, and Mom broke down like a child. All the tension, shame, and pain poured out. Michael, my 10-year-old son, brought Grandma his favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Hugs. He seriously explained that when he was sad, Mr. Hugs helped. Maybe he could help her too. Mom took the bear, pressed it to her chest, and smiled for the first time in days. Mom began to relax. She stopped rearranging things in the house and criticizing my housekeeping. Instead, she started making lunches for the grandkids, helping with homework, reading to them before bed. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as a dictator, but as an ordinary grandmother. Meanwhile, my lawyer was filing documents in court. We demanded the gift deed be declared invalid based on undue influence and elderly financial abuse. Richard hired a good attorney. His defense was that Mom had been of sound mind. All documents were properly executed. No one had coerced her. Gift-giving between spouses was common practice. The next day, I took her to a lawyer. James Connors specialized in elderly financial fraud cases. After hearing our story, he said this was a classic case of undue influence. The first step was contacting Adult Protective Services. Social worker Maria Sanchez came the next day and conducted a detailed interview with Mom about daily life with Richard, how financial decisions were made, who controlled mail and phone calls. We filed for a temporary freeze on all assets associated with Richard Clark. Judge Martinez agreed there was sufficient evidence of possible fraud. A criminal investigation began. Detective Rodriguez immediately recognized the pattern. He'd already received complaints about similar cases. A database check revealed that Richard's real name was Robert Clark, and complaints had already been filed against him in other states. The detective immediately recognized the scammer's signature. He explained that he'd already received several complaints about a man matching Richard's description. Always the same pattern: meeting lonely elderly women in public places, quickly establishing trust, gradually gaining control over finances. Rodriguez immediately began checking Richard in the database. It turned out the system already had records on Robert Clark, his real name. In 2019 in Georgia, 78-year-old Margaret Wilson had filed a complaint against him. But the case was closed due to lack of evidence. The woman died before trial, and Robert disappeared from the state. This discovery made the detective dig deeper. He contacted colleagues from other states through the National Elder Crime Database. The database was created in 2018 after the Federal Elder Justice Act was passed and combined information from all states. The search results were shocking. Over the past 7 years, the database had accumulated 12 complaints against Robert Clark and his aliases in 6 different states. The geography was impressive: Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North and South Carolina. The detective compiled a chronology of Robert's crimes. The scheme was worked out to the smallest detail. First, he'd study local newspapers, read obituaries, selecting recently widowed women. Then he'd appear in places they frequented: grocery stores, churches, libraries, medical centers. Robert always appeared as the perfect man for each specific victim. For religious women, he became a devout widower who had lost his wife to cancer. For gardening enthusiasts, a rose expert. For mom's type, a man obsessed with cleanliness and order. It was interesting to study his preparation for each scam. Robert would spend weeks observing potential victims, studying their habits, social circles, financial situation. He'd even join the same gyms or hobby clubs to learn more details about their lives. In Mom's case, he spent a month preparing. Neighbors later remembered seeing an unfamiliar man who was supposedly fixing his car near Mom's house. He watched her daily routine, learned when she went shopping, what time she watered flowers. The most cynical thing was how he studied her father's death. Robert read the obituary, learned details about the illness, then told Mom about his late wife who died from the same disease. This created an emotional connection based on shared grief. As the investigation progressed, even more disturbing details emerged. Robert didn't work completely alone. He had several fake friends who played necessary roles when needed, appearing as old buddies, confirming his stories about the past, creating the appearance of a normal social life. His wife Karen really knew about her husband's crimes and got her share. She handled the financial side, helped transfer money, opened bank accounts in her name, invested stolen funds in real estate. Karen told investigators she thought she was helping her husband with a legitimate business consulting elderly people. The most shocking discovery was that Robert's children were also used in the schemes, though they didn't know it. Their photos and school achievements helped Robert look like a respectable family man. He even brought the kids to meetings with some victims to demonstrate himself as a caring father. The investigation showed that in recent years, Robert had defrauded at least 5 elderly women in 3 states, stealing a total of about $800,000 and 4 properties. The most interesting discovery was that Robert belonged to closed online groups where scammers of his type exchanged experiences and new schemes. In correspondence seized from one of the group members, they discussed best practices for working with elderly people, ways to gain trust, legal loopholes. The FBI got involved when it became clear that the criminal activity crossed state lines. Special Agent Jennifer Cole from the Financial Crimes Division explained that such organized groups were a growing problem in the U.S. Agent Cole said that according to the National Council on Aging, fraud against the elderly grows by 12% each year. The statistics were frightening. Every 10th American woman over 60 becomes a victim of financial fraud. But only 44% of cases reach law enforcement. Many victims are ashamed to admit they were deceived. Particularly vulnerable are lonely women over 70 with their own real estate and declining health, exactly like Mom. The fear of becoming a burden makes them gratefully accept any help without asking unnecessary questions. The most difficult to solve were precisely romantic scams, like Mom's case. Victims long refused to believe in deception, protect scammers, refuse help from children and police. Robert's psychological profiling, conducted by the FBI, showed the classic portrait of a serial scammer: high intelligence, charm, ability to read people, complete lack of empathy. He viewed his victims not as people, but as sources of income. Interestingly, Robert never used the internet to find victims. He considered personal contact a more reliable way to gain trust. In the era of online dating, his old-fashioned approach seemed more sincere and safe to elderly women. He had a whole arsenal of cover stories. Documents showed that in recent years he'd been a widowed engineer, retired military man, former teacher, corporate retiree. For each role he had fake diplomas, recommendations, even family photos with fake deceased wives. Meanwhile, the lawyer was preparing a civil lawsuit. But first, we needed to gather irrefutable evidence of undue influence. In Florida, there's a special procedure for this under Section 732.5165 of the state statute. The key was proving 4 elements: victim vulnerability, the influencer's authority, influence actions or tactics, and unfairness of the result. To confirm Mom's vulnerability, we brought in forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Chen. She conducted a series of tests evaluating Mom's cognitive abilities, emotional state, and susceptibility to outside influence. The results showed that Mom was fully competent and had no cognitive impairments, but was in a state of emotional vulnerability due to recent health problems. Last year, she was diagnosed with early-stage osteoarthritis, which limited her mobility and forced her to rely more on help from others. Dr. Chen explained that elderly people facing health deterioration are especially susceptible to manipulation because they fear becoming a burden and seek support. Particularly important were the results of the test for susceptibility to social influence. Mom scored high on the scales of need for approval and conflict avoidance, exactly the traits scammers exploit. Robert's authority as an influencer was proven through witness testimony. Everyone noted how Mom changed around him, became less independent, constantly sought his approval, was afraid to make decisions without him. Bank employee Michael Torres gave particularly important testimony. He'd worked with Mom for 5 years and knew her communication style well. Torres said that before meeting Richard, Mom always asked questions herself, demanded explanations, carefully studied documents. After Richard appeared, everything changed. Mom would only come to the bank with him, stayed silent during meetings, let him speak for her. When Torres tried to address her directly, she'd get embarrassed and defer to her husband. The actions and tactics of influence were proven through medical records and witness testimony. Dr. Wilson from Mom's clinic provided detailed records of recent visits. The records showed Mom's progressively changing behavior. In January 2023, she still asked many questions about medications, wanted to know all side effects. By summer of that year, she was just nodding and agreeing with prescriptions, waiting for Richard's approval. Particularly telling was the record from September 2023. Patient avoids direct eye contact, constantly looks to spouse before answering. Increased anxiety observed. Additional depression screening recommended. But the most important note the doctor made in December: patient cannot remember names of medications she's taking, though she was always very knowledgeable about her treatment before. Spouse answers all questions for her. Recommend individual consultation with patient. This individual consultation never happened. Richard canceled subsequent appointments, citing Mom's fatigue. Pharmacist Patrick O'Brien from CVS, when Mom had bought medications for 20 years, also noticed changes. Mom used to always come for prescriptions herself, ask questions about drug interactions, demand explanations. Starting in fall 2023, only Richard came for medications. He presented a power of attorney to receive medications and explained that Rose has trouble leaving the house. When O'Brien offered delivery, Richard sharply refused. The unfairness of the result was obvious. A 74-year-old woman lost the house she'd lived in for 40 years and all her savings to a person she'd known for less than 3 years. A specialist in forensic graphology, James Marshall, certified by the American Association of Document Examiners, was brought into the case. He conducted a detailed analysis of Mom's signatures over the past 10 years. Marshall collected signature samples from various sources: bank documents, medical forms, tax returns, insurance policies. Then he compared them with the signature on the February 14th gift deed. The expert results were convincing. The signature on the gift deed showed classic signs of stress: uneven lines, changed slant, atypical writing speed. Pen pressure was uneven, indicating emotional tension. Particularly telling was the letter R at the beginning of Rosa. Usually, Mom wrote it with a characteristic flourish that had developed over years. In the signature on the gift deed, this flourish was absent, a sign that she was signing in haste or under pressure. Marshall also found that the signature was made with a shaking hand. Under detailed microscopic analysis, microtremors were visible that were atypical for Mom's usual signatures. This indicated nervous tension or coercion. The expert gave a conclusion with 89% probability that the signature was made under conditions of psychological stress or coercion. This was sufficient for court. In Florida, civil cases require confidence of more likely than not, more than 50%. A parallel examination of the gift deed document itself was conducted. It turned out that notary Mary Rodriguez, who certified the signatures, didn't have a valid license at the time of document execution. Her license had been revoked in 2022 for ethical violations. Moreover, the office address listed in the documents didn't correspond to reality. At that address, in February 2024, was a sporting goods store, not a legal office. I found the documents in Mom's folder were copies of everything: gift deed, house value certificates, notarial certifications. Everything was perfectly executed. Mom's signature, Richard's signature, notary seal. Mom didn't remember details about the notary. Some young woman, Maggie or Mary. Richard said she specialized in family law, often worked with elderly couples. They met at an office downtown. I found this notary, Mary Rodriguez, a recent law school graduate who'd gotten her license just 6 months earlier. When I called her, she nervously confirmed she remembered that meeting. Richard explained to her that it was a standard tax planning procedure between spouses, and the young notary didn't suspect foul play. Rodriguez admitted she didn't ask Mom additional questions, relying on Richard's confidence. I started with the bank. The manager who had serviced Mom's account for the past 5 years clearly remembered the changes in Mom's behavior after Richard appeared. Before, Mom always asked questions herself, demanded detailed explanations of all operations, carefully read documents before signing. After meeting Richard, everything changed dramatically. Mom would only come to the bank in his company, stayed silent during meetings, let him speak for her. When bank employees tried to address her directly, she'd get embarrassed and defer to her husband. Even more interesting were the bank records. 6 months before the house transfer, Richard had several times withdrawn large sums from the joint account, then returned the money. The amounts were big, $20,000, $30,000. The lawyer studied the statements and explained this looked like training. Richard was getting Mom used to the idea that large financial operations were normal, that she could trust him in such matters. Mom's family doctor, Dr. Wilson, also noticed changes. At recent appointments, Mom was anxious, constantly looked to Richard before answering questions. Yet she used to be a woman who knew everything about her health, down to the smallest detail. She became dependent on her husband for decision-making. Not uncommon in old age, but such behavior was atypical for her. Neighbors confirmed that in recent months, Richard controlled Mom's mail, answered phone calls even when Mom was home. Mrs. Johnson said she tried several times to talk to Mom over the fence, but Richard would always appear and lead his wife into the house, saying Rose was tired and needed rest. But she didn't look tired. She looked sad. But we had trump cards. First, graphological examination showed that Mom's signature on the documents was significantly different from her usual signature. The lines were uneven, with signs of stress and uncertainty, classic signs of signing under psychological pressure. Second, the detective found 3 other victims of Richard in other states, ready to testify about an identical scheme of deception. Third, bank records showed strange rehearsals 6 months before executing the gift deed. Richard repeatedly withdrew large sums from the joint account, then returned them. This was psychological preparation, getting Mom used to large financial operations without questions. Fourth, witnesses confirmed Mom's isolation. Neighbors, the family doctor, bank employees all noticed how in recent months Mom became dependent on Richard, stopped making independent decisions. The trial lasted 3 months. Richard denied the charges to the end, claimed he was being framed. But there was too much evidence. Judge Martinez didn't hide her outrage when sentencing. She stated that using the trust and vulnerability of elderly people for personal financial gain was one of the most disgusting types of crimes. Robert received 12 years in prison on 4 counts of elderly fraud and 1 year for money laundering. Regarding property return, the court ruled that the gift deed was the result of undue influence and should be declared invalid. Mom's house officially returned to her. Robert tried to appeal the decision, but the appellate court left the verdict unchanged. Most of the stolen money couldn't be found. Robert had managed to transfer Mom's $83,000 to offshore accounts. However, through a civil lawsuit, we managed to recover about $15,000 from the sale of his personal property, car, and valuables. The rest of the money was lost forever. The most unexpected turn was Mom's decision. When the court ruled to return her house, she said she didn't want to go back there. Too many bad memories. Moreover, Mom added to my surprise, she liked living with our big noisy family. We sold Mom's house and divided the money into 2 parts, as Mom insisted. First, we built an additional room onto our house specifically for her. She chose the wall color herself, soft yellow, comfortable furniture, not necessarily perfectly aligned, and decorations, photos of grandchildren, not awards for cleanliness. With the remaining money, Mom established an education fund for her grandchildren. She said she wanted something good to come out of this nightmare, and the opportunity to give the kids college education without debt seemed like the right way to honor what she'd been through. Now Mom has been living with us for 2 years. She no longer demands perfect order and doesn't criticize my housekeeping methods. Instead, she became an amazing grandmother, patient, loving, full of stories and wisdom. The kids adore her. Emma teaches Grandma to use social media and helps her communicate with other elderly people online. Michael tells her about school every evening and asks for advice on various matters. Mom blossomed in this role. Sometimes I think Robert unwittingly did us a favor. He destroyed the walls Mom had built around herself for years. He forced her to trust people, first him, then us. And though his betrayal was painful, it led to our family finally becoming a real family. Sometimes Mom talked about that period in her life. She said Richard made her believe she'd finally found someone who understood her. He used her need for control against her, made her think her perfectionism was a virtue, not a flaw. When I asked if she regretted it, Mom would answer, trusting a scammer. Of course, losing money, yes, but she didn't regret that it brought her here, to us. Mom started working as a volunteer with an organization protecting elderly people. She told her story to other elderly women, helped them recognize signs of fraud. After meetings, she'd say that not everyone could be saved, but even if one woman didn't become a victim thanks to her story, then all her suffering wasn't in vain. Detective Rodriguez told us that thanks to our case, they were able to create a database of scammers specializing in elderly people. Mom's story helped save other people from similar fates. Most importantly, Mom is happy. For the first time in many years, she lives without constant stress and control. She learned to accept imperfection, find joy in family life's chaos, love unconditionally. When I look at her playing with grandchildren on the living room floor, surrounded by scattered toys and children's drawings, I understand that we finally got the mother we dreamed of in childhood. It took fraud and a court case to free her from the prison she'd built for herself, from rules and demands. Robert thought he was using Mom's need for order against her. But ultimately, he helped her understand that real order isn't perfectly ironed sheets and alphabetically arranged books. Real order is family gathered for dinner, where you can laugh and argue, spill juice on the tablecloth without fear of getting scolded. Real order is a grandmother who doesn't criticize grandchildren for dirty hands, but teaches them to bake cookies. Real order is the ability to be yourself without fear of judgment. In the end, justice triumphed not only in the courtroom. It triumphed in our home, where instead of a dictator, a loving mother and grandmother settled in. Robert Clark is serving time in prison, and Mom Rosa plays hide and seek with her grandchildren, and her laughter fills the house with warmth we've been waiting for all our lives. Now Mom has been living with us for 3 years. She's no longer the strict woman who terrorized us in childhood with demands for perfect order. Instead, she became the center of our family. The kids run to her with any problems. Emma shares secrets about first crushes. Michael tells her about school conflicts. Mom listens, gives advice, hugs. She learned to love unconditionally. Sometimes the granddaughter would ask why Grandma hadn't lived with them before. Mom would answer that she'd been foolish, thought order was more important than love. When asked if her opinion had changed, she'd answer that now she knows love is the real order. Detective Rodriguez told us that thanks to our case, police were able to create a database of scammers specializing in elderly people. Mom's story helped identify a whole network of criminals operating on similar schemes in several states. Robert turned out to be part of an organized group. They had fake documents, fake friends, a whole system for laundering stolen funds through fictitious companies. Thanks to testimony from Mom and other victims, 7 more people were arrested and over $2 million was returned to victims. Sometimes I think about how Robert, unwittingly, gave us the greatest service. He destroyed the walls Mom had built around herself for years. He forced her to lose control, and in that loss of control, she found freedom. Freedom to be imperfect, freedom to make mistakes, freedom to love without conditions. When I look at Mom reading bedtime stories to grandchildren, surrounded by scattered toys and children's drawings, I understand. We finally got the mother we dreamed of all our lives. It took a scammer and a court case to free her from the prison of her own rules. Robert Clark thought he was using Mom's need for order for his own purposes. But ultimately he helped her understand that real order isn't perfectly ironed sheets and alphabetically arranged books. Real order is family gathered for dinner, where you can laugh and argue, spill juice on the tablecloth without fear of getting yelled at. Real order is a grandmother who doesn't criticize grandchildren for dirty hands, but teaches them to bake cookies. Real order is the ability to be yourself without fear of judgment. Ultimately, justice triumphed not only in the courtroom, it triumphed in our home, where instead of a dictator, a loving mother and grandmother took residence. Robert Clark is serving his sentence in prison, and Mom Rosa goes to sleep each night, surrounded by family who love her exactly as she is. Imperfect, human, real. And that's the most just victory of all.